Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 71. And today I'm joined by Scott Sauber to chat about GitHub Actions. So welcome to the show, Scott.
Hey Dan, thanks for having me.
Oh, you're most welcome. So we're going to talk about GitHub Actions and CI/CD and all this kind of thing. And a lot of my background has been Azure DevOps for CI/CD kind of stuff. I've done bits in GitHub Action, but it's kind of, I really want to do more. I really want to do it's GitHub and it just sounds cooler. But I've been stuck in Azure DevOps land because. And well, before we dig into that, if you could just introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a bit about what you do, and then we can dive into GitHub Actions.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, my name's Scott Sauber. I'm the director of engineering at a software consulting company called Lean Techniques. We're roughly like 140 people based in Des Moines, Iowa, kind of in the center of the US. But we've got people in 15 or maybe 16 states in the US. So we work with like Fortune 100 companies down to startups and kind of everything in between. Usually what we're doing is we are helping people like upskill on different practices such as CI/CD, test-driven development, working in smaller batches, trunk-based development, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of what we do is kind of upskilling people in that area. Hence, I've done a lot of GitHub Actions and also using, I've used Bitbucket, Azure DevOps, Circle CI, TFS build and deploys back in the day. I've used Octopus Deploy. I've used a lot of different CI/CD tools. And I was counting up the other day and I was realizing I've worked with like 30 different clients. So I've seen a lot of different things. So it's cool to see a lot of different things. But also then that's kind of led to like, I see what people do right and wrong, which is nice. So I've seen people do things with CI/CD platforms that maybe they shouldn't have done it, or maybe they don't even have CI/CD at all and have never even heard of it. So yeah, just kind of that whole gambit there. But primarily my background's in .NET and done a lot of JavaScript, cloud DevOps stuff over the last 15 years or so.
So all those different platforms, CI/CD platforms that you listed out, which is your favorite? Unbiasedly, because I've obviously got the topic of, if you take out the topic of this podcast, do you have one that jumps out as being better?
Yeah, so I've used a lot of CI/CD tools, like I mentioned, and I would say GitHub is definitely my preferred when I'm using GitHub for source control by default, just because of that tight integration. It's all integrated with the pull requests, the commits. You can see like the little checkbox or check mark that says, hey, this passed. But I will say, like, while GitHub Actions can do CD, it's definitely not necessarily a first-class citizen. Like, there's a lot of these tools out there that are CI-specific tools, but they can also do CD, but it's not really a first-class citizen where they don't have certain concepts of, like, deployments and releases, which GitHub does, but it's definitely, like, a CI-first tool, whereas you take something like Octopus Deploy, that's like a CD-first tool, and so you have first-class concepts like multi-tenancy and things like that. But I would say what I'm seeing in the market right now is there's a big move towards GitHub. Like people are moving off of things like Bitbucket, even Azure DevOps, because they see a big investment going into GitHub in general. And so because it's very natural to say like, hey, I'm already on GitHub, why don't I just use GitHub Actions? We're definitely seeing a lot of our clients at least inquire about GitHub if they're not already on GitHub. And then obviously if you buy GitHub, you get free minutes and all that kind of stuff kind of baked into what you purchase. So yeah, I would say GitHub Actions is definitely my default tool of choice nowadays until I have a reason to kind of do something else.
You mentioned then a few things like CI and CD, and kind of assuming most of the listeners understand and probably use pipelines so that trigger off Git commits and that kind of thing. But there is the CI and there's two CDs, and I guess it's probably worth just defining what each of these three things is, because I think there's a lot of overlap and confusion between them.
Yeah, absolutely. So CI is continuous integration, and a lot of people, I'll go on a mini rant here in a second, but a lot of people think that when they hear CI, they think, oh, I've got an automated build server. And that's what a lot of people talk about when they say they have like a CI pipeline. They're talking, hey, when you commit and push, it automatically triggers something to happen. And usually that something is doing things like running an automated build to, hey, can the app even compile? Running the tests saying, hey, do the test pass, running like linters and formatters, say, hey, is the code formatted in a certain way? Or, is our code style being enforced? All of those kinds of things. So that's kind of where CI comes into play is, hey, you're kind of doing a verification like, hey, is the code in a good state? Because if the code doesn't compile, I'm guessing your app's going to probably have a bad time trying to run. So That's typically what people mean when they talk about CI. Now, there is like CI the practice. So people talk about, hey, continuous integration isn't just a build server, it's something that you do, not something that you have. So I try and push teams a lot of times to like, hey, how often are you integrating back into the main branch? Because every time you get like a merge conflict, for instance, saying like, hey, somebody else changed this file and did something that conflicts with what you tried to do, that's kind of a feedback loop telling you you haven't been integrating your code as consistently or as often as you should be. Usually that's kind of an indicator. So if you're constantly getting merge conflicts, you should be continuously integrating your code. So you should try and have like short-lived branches that are like ideally a day or less, in my opinion, and be continuously integrating your code back into the main branch. So that's kind of my mini rant around CI, but most people are talking about the build server, but there's like also the practice side of continuous integration, which is kind of where it originally got its start.
So CI is kind of like you're also including like the whatever Git branching strategy you use and making sure that you're having these short-lived branches and stuff. And that's even before you necessarily think about the build server at all.
Yep. So I'm a big fan of trunk-based development, which kind of forces you to have one long running branch, which is like your main or default branch, and not doing things like git flow, doing environment branches and things like that. And if you actually look at, so Atlassian's a popular software tool that makes things like Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, all those kinds of things. And if you look at their documentation for git flow, if you Google git flow Atlassian, they'll actually say this is a legacy workflow. You should be using trunk-based development. So this isn't just a me thing. It's I'd say the industry is kind of moving that direction where you do this trunk-based development where there's only one long-running branch.
I wonder how many companies, and like this is going back a while because as you say, it's kind of like seen as a legacy practice now, but you know that diagram explaining git flow, and like a lot of companies probably like, printed it off and development teams put it on the wall because it's that complicated. And yeah, I agree, just like get your main branch working and make sure there's good test coverage to make sure it's working, and then it's always in a releasable state, because then you get rid of so many different headaches and wasting time managing branches, juggling branches.
Yeah, and I find people don't have to know Git as well, to be honest, when you just do trunk-based development, because then you're not cherry picking as much where you're plucking one commit from a branch to another, and you're not like backporting commits to other branches. Like you just, so many problems go away and it just makes things way simpler.
One thing you've then got to start thinking about, and this could be a whole podcast episode on itself, so I won't go too much into this, but like the concept of feature toggles, because if main branch is always releasable, you need to be able to turn things on and off on something that's already been deployed. But yeah, that can be, we might touch back on that later, but that can be a different one. So I guess moving on to the next CD.
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's two CDs with the same acronym, or I learned it's actually an initialism, because an acronym is something that you can spell out like a word, whereas initialism is, two letters put together that don't make a word.
Today I learned.
Yeah, I got corrected by somebody, and then I looked it up. I'm like, oh, they are accurate. So anyway, back to CDs and the two CDs. So there's continuous delivery and continuous deployment. So they're pretty close to the same thing. There's one little nuance with them. So continuous delivery is basically saying, hey, I've got my deployment process automated behind a button. And usually when people say continuous delivery, if they're using the proper definition, what that means is they've got automated deployments usually all the way up to prod, and then somebody has to click the approve button to say, yep, I approve this to go to production. And so they still have a manual step in there where they say, yes, go to production. Now they might also have buttons like in earlier environments like staging, QA, test, whatever you call it, where maybe they auto deploy to like a dev environment and then you manually promote through. But the idea behind continuous delivery is you have your deployments automated where they're at most a push of a button. The nuance between continuous delivery and continuous deployment is there is no manual step in the middle. It just, if the build is green and you deploy to dev, you deploy to UAT, you deploy to staging, whatever environments you have, and those are all green, it's going to roll its way all the way to prod. So that's the difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment is deployment, there's no manual step. It just automatically goes straight to production. Now that sounds kind of heresy to a lot of people, and I'm sure some people listening are thinking to themselves like, wow, that sounds really dangerous. And it is if you don't have the proper safety nets in place. Like if you don't have zero downtime deployments, for instance, and you take an outage every time you go to production, like that's kind of a blocker to doing true continuous deployment. Or if you don't have things like automated tests or health checks or some of these things that provide safety nets for you, then it can be dangerous to do continuous deployment. But I try and push some teams to say like, okay, why can't you do continuous deployment? Like when your build is green, why aren't you confident to go to production? And think about what are those things? And sometimes it's like, oh, we don't have zero downtime deployments. It's like, okay, let's go fix that. Now what? In a dev environment, I always go out there and manually click around and do this stuff. It's like, okay, well, that's probably an automated test you could write. And then kind of rethink about those things on like a feedback loop of like, okay, now why am I not confident to go to production? Now why? Until you start running out of things or you're like grasping at straws on stuff. So I try and push teams to go to continuous deployment. And we have one of our clients who used to deploy monthly and they'd roll back about half the time. And now they're deploying upwards of 20 plus times a day. And they're rolling back less than 1% of those. But again, we put in a lot of those safety checks of like automated tests, health checks, zero downtime deployments, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think another difference, and so in one of my clients, we've been, funnily enough, having these conversations quite recently, and we're starting getting more and more like services over to CD. I can't say CD, continuous deployment. And we realized this was another pro of doing this, is that when it's not continuous deployment, when you're reviewing PRs, it's kind of, you quick glance over, yeah, that looks fine, it's fine,
Yep.
it'll go through. It's going to go through QA, it's whatever. But when you know that when that PR gets merged, when it gets completed, that build is going to go to production, as a reviewer, you give it a second look. You look at it a lot harder. Can this break production? Making the PR reviewer and the author as well really think about it before that PR gets merged in. I think that's actually very valuable.
Absolutely. And you also write good automated tests that you have confidence in as well. So I definitely like that it forces you towards that behavior. And one of the guys I work with, he coined this term operations first delivery. And the idea there is, hey, if we've got a greenfield app, let's start with production, deploy to production first. Let's not add like the earlier environments until we need them. Like we're going to need them, but let's start deploying all the way to production first. Like let's just get a hello world out there. Because I'm sure you've been in the situation too. If you've got a greenfield app, you might start with a dev environment, then you add like another environment, and then you might wait till you hit some period of time where then you're gonna deploy to production. It's like, okay, do we have like all the secrets in the secret store? Do we have all of this kind of stuff that you kind of delay until the end? Versus if you start with production and kind of work your way backwards, a few things happen. Number one, once people start doing continuous deployment, I find that they don't want to go back to continuous delivery. So it kind of forces you into continuous deployment first because they're like, oh, it's kind of nice that, my changes are always going. And then two, it always makes you start thinking about production and thinking about what are those things? Do I need to put secrets in the secret store? Do I need a firewall port open? Whatever the case is. So that way you're thinking about production from the get-go. So yeah, anytime you're doing a greenfield app, I would start with continuous deployment and see where it takes you. And my experience tells me that you're not going to want to go back to continuous delivery.
Another thing I found where you're not doing CD, like so the client I mentioned where we're now trying to move to CD, because it's more of a microservice architecture, so we've got lots of different pipelines deploying different things, that when we're not doing CD and you've got to manage approvals through the different environments, it's really hard to manage what's been deployed, what's not deployed. And if you've got like one of your services that's a dependency of what you're working on or transitive dependency, then it's kind of really difficult. In the same way as what we were talking about before with the branches and doing like Git flow and that kind of thing, then it's the same kind of thing if you're managing lots of microservices and not knowing where each of them are deployed to, what's been QA'd and what's not been QA'd, where actually, even though, as you say, it sounds more scary, everything straight through to prod, you just know where everything's at. Everything's just in one state, really, in prod.
Absolutely. Right, exactly. And I'm guessing a lot of people listening to your story there about like what's deployed where are feeling that pain, as well as I've seen a lot of energy spent between like the product side or business analyst side and the devs of like, what's deployed where or what's been approved, what's not been approved, is everything ready to go? Okay, now we're going to push the button. All of that just evaporates and goes away when you do continuous deployment. So I really challenge people to think about like, okay, why are you doing the things that you're doing? Is there a way that this could get removed completely? And I find a lot of problems just kind of evaporate when you do continuous deployment. Again, assuming you have a lot of those safety checks in place that we talked about earlier.
I think that's it. And as you say, it kind of enforces, it's like self-questioning yourself or the team self-questioning themselves about if they're saying, why can't they do it? and taking each of those questions and trying to resolve each of those questions until there's no reason you can't do it. I think that's a really good iterative practice till you can get there, I guess.
Yep.
So I guess with this episode is about GitHub Actions. Like, it's been really valuable having that as a prerequisite. But moving on to GitHub Actions, and this is more YAML, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, YAML all the things. No.
Yep. We're all just YAML developers at the end of the day.
So as I said before, I've done a lot of stuff in Azure DevOps, so Azure DevOps pipelines. So I'll probably be drawing parallels as part of this conversation. And you said you've used lots anyway, so I'm assuming you're doing. And then when it comes down to it, they all do the same thing. It's just in different ways. I guess one of the pain points, this is one thing that drives me nuts about Azure DevOps pipelines, and I'm hoping GitHub Actions as a solution, is when you're actually developing a pipeline in YAML, the turnaround for having to push, let it trigger, and then wait for it is a pain in the, I won't say something that I need to beep out, but it's really painful, what do you call it? Development loop
feedback
cycle.
loop.
Yeah, feedback loop. In GitHub Actions, can you actually develop these locally?
So natively, no. One of my most popular tweets, and I'm going to call them tweets, not X posts, because I just refuse to call it X, it was something to the effect of creating pipelines be like, and then it was like a bunch of red circles emojis and then one green one at the end. But then when you get to the green one, you're like, I'm not even sure if it still worked. And you got to go verify things before you kind of build up that trust. But yeah, natively GitHub Actions doesn't have something to run locally, but there is a project called Act that can run GitHub Actions locally. There are some caveats with it. Obviously, what you can do is you could have, extract stuff out to scripts and run those scripts locally, but you still run into the problem of like, hey, am I passing the right parameters to that script and all of those kinds of things. So yeah, unfortunately, there's not really a native way of doing things. However, GitHub Actions also makes it really easy to reuse different, what they call workflows, which is kind of your whole process. Similar to Azure DevOps as a similar concept with their templates where you can reuse some of those things. So the nice thing is once you get some of this stuff in place, then you can start reusing them across multiple repositories.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just looking at the GitHub project repo for Act, and it's got 53,000 stars, so it seems to be quite popular as well.
Yep, a few people have used it.
Just a few. That's good though, because that is, as I say, it's kind of, I don't mind Azure DevOps pipelines, it does the job, but it's just when you're developing something that's maybe a bit more of a complicated pipeline, just the whole thing where you've got like multiple stages, and the thing you're working on is the third stage or the fourth stage. And like I end up having to just comment out a whole bunch of stuff just so I can minimize that feedback loop to get that one missing indentation that's wrong working out, sort of something like that. But it's just so it's nice to know there's a local thing as well.
The good news is if you do screw up the YAML part of it and the YAML's not even valid, it'll tell you immediately when you try and run the GitHub action. So let's say it's in your third stage, like your last environment, you screwed up the YAML formatting, it'll bomb from the very beginning, which I'm pretty sure Azure DevOps does as well if the YAML's not valid. But yeah, if there's something custom in that environment or something where you forgot to pass a parameter or something like that, yeah, the feedback loop on CI/CD pipelines in general is just not great, where you might be waiting 20 minutes to actually hit the environment you made the change in and then find out that you screwed something up.
So you mentioned templates before, or reusable bits of logic of the pipeline. I think you call it something else.
Yeah, so reusable workflows. So I guess just to back up a little bit, workflows are basically the entire YAML file. You can think of it as essentially where it's got, your triggers, which are, hey, I'm going to run this GitHub action, this workflow on, a creation of a pull request or a merge to main, or, you can even do like, hey, when an issue gets opened, go ahead and run this bit of code. So maybe you want to like add a comment to the issue saying, hey, did you follow these certain things? So GitHub Actions has a lot of triggers such as those, as well as one called Workflow Dispatch, which is basically one that you can reuse the workflow across multiple different workflows. So take deployments, for instance. This is a very common one to extract out into a reusable workflow. When you're deploying to like, let's say you have like dev, UAT for user acceptance testing, and production, like you just have 3 environments. The deployment for all 3 of those is probably identical other than like the names of where you're deploying things to, maybe some certain secrets, whatever the case may be. But The actual act is the exact same thing. So if you're like deploying database changes and you're deploying code, or you're like building a Docker image and pushing that up to a container registry, all of those actions are the exact same. We're using the word actions there, but all those steps are the exact same. It's just you're pushing them to different spots, or maybe the names are different of a lot of those things. So it's really common to extract out like the deployment step to a reusable workflow. And what's nice is you can actually reuse them across different repositories. So all you have to do essentially is reference a GitHub org, a repository, and then the file that you're using. So as long as you have line of sight, you have access to that repository, you can reuse those workflows across all your repositories. So you can develop standards across your org of like, hey, when we build a .NET app or a JavaScript app or a Java app, we do it in this way. Or when we deploy, we do it in this way. And then everybody can reuse those just by referencing that GitHub action in another repo.
So if you want a workflow that's open source and public and share that with everyone that wants to use it, you don't need to publish it anywhere. It's literally a case of your repo is public, so people can reference it via the URL effectively, or parts of the URL.
Yeah, and I can send you some links to put in the show notes of how to do some of that stuff. But yeah, you can just literally just reference the repo and the file, and then you at the end you target which branch you're targeting on. So you have like you do the full path to the YAML file, and then you do like at main or at V1. Some people version things by branches and things like that. So that's how you can reuse things. Now, I wouldn't recommend necessarily just, using some random person's GitHub Actions workflow. Like you should vet who it is and all that kind of stuff. And maybe even like take that code and you take ownership of it now too, because obviously if you say, hey, I'm just going to take, their latest from main or whatever the case is, and you don't know who this person is, obviously they could change things and now you're running their workflow. So it's the exact same concept as like when you grab a NuGet package or an NPM package or things like that, you kind of have to vet who the person is, how much activity is there, is this thing going to be maintained, that kind of stuff. But then you can also take ownership of it as well.
Might that workflow that someone else, that community workflow, be referencing another workflow, so it's transitive workflow as well?
Yep. So what I described is kind of the reusable workflow way. There's also like a GitHub Actions marketplace where you can say, hey, give me this particular package of this version. So there's kind of two different ways you can reuse workflows, the marketplace and the file way. I find that a lot of our clients are doing the file way. It's just a lot easier versus like publishing things to the marketplace, and like to make changes, you kind of all get it all at once. But then of course you got to be mindful of like, hey, is this a breaking change that you're making to this workflow or any of that kind of stuff? So yeah, there is also a marketplace way of deploying things. So that's what a lot of people do for like public workflows, is they'll deploy like a GitHub action to the marketplace. But then what I find is like when you're doing custom things of like, oh, we're deploying to Azure, AWS, or GCP, or on-prem, whatever it is, we want our custom workflow. And that's what I find people gravitate more towards the file system. So I'd say public stuff is more the marketplace, but private enterprise stuff is more the workflow files.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess my question was from a security point of view, it's not just vetting what you're depending on, it's vetting what they're depending on too. In the same way as you
Correct.
mentioned with NuGet, you've got to do the same kind of thing, because you've got this whole tree of dependencies and they're all you're pulling them all in effectively. So it's quite scary if you actually think about it too much.
I know it's a wonder that software even works at all sometimes, of like all the things that you're depending on and all the things that you're kind of building up on the graph. It's kind of a wonder that software works at all. And sometimes it doesn't, like the whole, people unpublishing things from NPM, for instance, that breaks the internet. Not to get into the left pad.
The more later one, did you hear about the everything one?
I don't think so.
I think someone published a package called Everything, and it depended on everything. I can't remember the full thing, but I think because it depended on everything, and you can't unpublish a package where things are depending on you, no one could unpublish the packages, but anyone that pulled in this package, like NPM installed everything, so it crashed the computers and took resources. There was a whole bunch of things. I'll find it. I can't remember the full details, but I think it's been in one of the past show notes because it's come up before. So I'll find it and put it in the show notes for this episode. But that was kind of like, I don't want to say it was hilarious, but it obviously caused people lots of issues, but it was pretty funny.
Yep.
I guess also, like before you referenced that you could trigger these pipelines in different ways, so like PR things, but also if someone creates a GitHub issue and that kind of thing. Is it called GitHub events, where it's more like event driven, where you can trigger off different things in GitHub?
Yeah, so they're called GitHub triggers, and so yeah, if you Google GitHub Actions triggers, I mean, I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but almost everything you can think of, using a discussion, opening an issue, opening a pull request, pushing to a branch. I mean, I would say opening a pull request and pushing to a branch are the two most common workflow triggers, but pretty much anything you could think of in GitHub Actions, or at least I haven't run into anything where I wanted to trigger off something that didn't already exist that they thought about. But one unique trigger that people don't think about is they actually have cron job support. So you can say, hey, every day wake up and run this piece of code. Now I will say they don't put a lot of guarantees around the cron job support. So don't base your whole cron job workflow around GitHub Actions as an enterprise. But if you have something like personal where it's like, hey, every day I want to get sent an email or something like that, I've got some of that kind of stuff and it works just fine. It's been consistent, but they don't guarantee it's always going to run at this time. Usually it's within 5 to 15 minutes of that. Sometimes it's right on the money and other times it's 15 minutes later. So again, they don't really say hey, make this an enterprise cron job scheduler a lot of cloud platforms offer, but it's nice if you have just some small things that you want to do, or hey, wake up every day and run a security scan right around what it is that we're doing. Yeah, I could go into a whole thing about, security scanning and stuff like that, which we can do, but I guess I'll just leave it as that's a common thing of hey, run a security scan every single day. But I also see some clients do oh, we're going to run an automated build every day. And I'm like, no, just run that on any change that happens. Don't necessarily delay that until the end of the day or something like that, because if somebody screwed something up, they're not going to find out until hours or even days later by the time they get back to it. So
yeah, definitely. It feels like this GitHub triggers is more like an event-driven kind of thing anyway, so it's kind of rather than a batching system. But it was quite interesting where you said about you've got something which sends an email. It's basically an automation system, really, isn't it? It doesn't have to be building software. Have you come across any kind of weird and wonderful, different ways of using pipelines that aren't just building and deploying software?
That's a great question. I haven't really come into anything that's super unique, minus the whole wake up, send me an email or send me a reminder or run this bit of code. But definitely GitHub Actions, while it's primarily used for CI/CD pipelines, it can be used for lots of different things. And it's really an automation tool more so than it is a, CI/CD tool, but it does CI/CD really well. Just it can also do some automation things people open up a GitHub issue. They might want to comment back hey, did you try these things? Or here's an FAQ. Or maybe you have open up an issue and on a trigger, it sends it to some AI service that reads in the issue and then tries to answer the question that the person has. And something like that, hey, you're running into this error message. Did you see this in the FAQs or something like that? So you can do lots of different things based on those triggers.
Yeah, it sounds very cool. You did mention about security scanning things. So maybe we do dig into that. As in, does it have built-in security scanning, or would you always use a third-party plugin or extension?
Yeah, so GitHub itself does have CodeQL for security scanning, but there's also a lot of other security scanning tools. I mean, there's Sneak, depending on if you're scanning infrastructure as code, for instance, to make sure, let's say you're spinning up a web app and some of these infrastructure as code scanners can check hey, do you only support TLS 1.2 and higher or something like that, so people aren't using some of these insecure protocols. Things like that. There's Terrascan for Terraform. There's SonarQube can do some of this stuff. There's a lot of tools out there that can do this static code analysis, which is, hey, let me take in the source code and see if I can find any security vulnerability. So yeah, it's not really part of GitHub Actions per se, but GitHub Actions can integrate with CodeQL and all these other tools that I'm talking about. So for instance, why somebody might run those, well, I would say you should run a security scan as part of your main pipeline. So if you do introduce a vulnerability, you catch it on the PR ideally before it gets merged in. But sometimes people might do things Docker, for instance, and Docker images, which Docker images are great because, they're immutable, they don't change, all that kind of stuff. And so, they're going to run consistently. The problem is they don't auto update. So if .NET or Node or Java releases a security patch, you don't automatically get a free update like you would on an Azure App Service or Elastic Beanstalk or Lambdas or functions or something like that, where you say, hey, I'm just targeting .NET 8 or this particular Node version. and you kind of get a free update because they manage that for you. With Docker, you're kind of managing that yourself. So sometimes you might do a security scan that says like, hey, is the last image that I pulled, is there a new runtime version that I should upgrade to? And maybe then that triggers like, okay, I should rebuild an image with the latest runtime version and kind of kick it back up. So yeah, it just kind of depends. I mean, we all have those apps that, you create and then they just kind of sit in the corner and you don't touch for a while. So that would be like a scenario where obviously if you're touching something all the time, the security scan's always running. But if you don't touch it for a while, the security scan's not running very often. So that might be a reason to introduce a cron job that's running a security scan daily or whatever makes sense for your situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess with the auto scanning, there's also like out-of-date dependencies, and I know I get lots of emails. Is it Dependabot, is it?
Yep.
So all these different steps along the way. It's kind of like that's part of your build. It's not just build and deploying. It's got like you've got your maybe linting checks, like you're running your unit tests, and then later once it's deployed or once spun up in Docker, you've got integration tests and security tests and just all the things. But it's kind of it's very, and it feels like a lot of these should be just standard where like all these. As you're building a pipeline, you've got to think about all these things. Maybe you shouldn't have to think about these things. It's just like, build me my app, and all of these things you should just get. In the same way as with Dependabot, I've not asked for Dependabot, but it just happens in my repositories. I get the emails. It feels like you should get a similar kind of thing. But then I guess you've got to have written the test in the first place for a lot of these things. You can see why you have, I'm going to use the term DevOps engineers, but it's kind of, I can't even define what the word DevOps means nowadays.
Yeah, that's honestly why a lot of companies are moving towards platform teams and platform engineering, where it's like, okay, I'm going to create, this is the way we do all of those things that, you just mentioned. There's trade-offs with, centralizing some of that. Obviously, you get more consistency, but then maybe people don't understand how things work either. So yeah, there's we could probably have a whole show on platform teams and platform engineering and DevOps teams and yeah, all that kind of stuff.
I think we've had a few of those now because it kind of seems to be a hot topic with the whole platform engineering. I think I actually had one with someone called Dishant. I can't remember what episode number it was. I think the title was platform engineering. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic. We spoke about like when we talk about like the two CDs, we talk about approvals and approving between the stages with approval gates. I know approval gates in Azure DevOps because that's what I use. I use GitHub Actions for my own stuff, but Azure DevOps for clients and things. And for my own stuff, I don't use approval gates. So I've never seen what those look like in GitHub Actions. Is that quite easy to use?
Yep. So GitHub has the concept of environments, which are just, what are your deployment environments that you have, like dev, UAT, staging, production, whatever. And so when you set up those environments, then you can say, hey, right now I'm deploying to dev, I'm deploying to UAT or test, staging, and then I'm deploying to production. And as part of those, you can say, hey, this person needs to manually approve things to go to this environment. So the most common one, obviously, is production, so if you go under like settings in GitHub and then you set up the environment, there's some things that you can do to that environment. And one of them is saying, hey, who are the manual approvers of this environment? Or maybe it's like a group of people. So anybody in that group can approve that pipeline. So you kind of have that integration between GitHub environments, and then you say like, hey, I want a manual approver. But again, I try and push people away from that and get them thinking like, what can you do? But if you're in a legacy code situation, I guess we didn't call this out specifically, but if you got a legacy app, don't immediately go to continuous deployment without putting some of these safety nets in place, because that's just dangerous. But so if you are in that situation where you're doing more continuous delivery, you can just integrate with GitHub Actions environments.
Yeah, it sounds very similar to Azure DevOps, where you've got environments and then the approvals are tied to those. And I find that we almost end up, because we've got the core environments across the whole company, where it's like dev, QA, staging, production, but actually we've got different teams in that. So you kind of almost end up creating a team name or product name, whatever it is, hyphen QA, and then combining them somehow. And it feels like you need almost like another facet into these approvals. But yeah, it sounds like GitHub Actions is very, very similar. How about, I'm thinking about things we've not covered now. You did mention about secrets earlier, but we didn't really delve into what that looks like in GitHub Actions.
Yep. So GitHub Actions has the concept of secrets, where, again, if you go to the settings tab in your repository and then kind of scroll down on the left, there's a secrets tab. And so there's a few different parts of this. So the first thing is, when you create a secret, it's a one-way write. So there's no reading back out secrets. So when you create a secret, you give it the key, obviously, and then the value, and you hit save. And now you can't read that secret back out. And even if you echo it out or console write line or console log it into your GitHub action, it's going to star it all out. So it's kind of pre-filtering the logs that you see and saying like, hey, does any of this match secret? If so, I'm going to star it out. Now you can technically get at a secret if you really want to. So you could do things like, hey, let's write the secret out to a file within your GitHub action or send it to an API, and it's not going to mask those kinds of things. But obviously that's a lot more work than, you're typically going to do. So if you ever need to like, hey, what's the value of the secret? Is it the right value? Usually I'll just like overwrite it and set it to what I know the right value is rather than kind of monkey around with trying to read it back out. But within GitHub Actions, you just do a templating syntax that's like $ curly curly secrets dot whatever the variable name is, and then ends it with curly curly. So that's kind of how you drop it into the places that you need to drop it into. So this might be like API keys or, client secrets, things like that you don't want to share. And so your pipeline, your YAML file doesn't actually have the secret value. It just has a reference to what that secret is. Now you can also have secrets tied to environments too. So if you go all in on environments, which you probably should, you can also have environments tied to, or secrets tied to environments. Because if you don't do that, otherwise you're going to have to like prefix or suffix all of your secrets with like, oh, this is my dev one, this is my production one, whatever the case is. So once you tie those secrets to environments, then you can have the same names across all of your environments. So your pipeline doesn't have to say like, oh, I'm doing dev, I need to prefix this with dev underscore. I can just, use the secret name. And when I say, hey, I'm deploying to dev, it'll just figure out to pull the secret from the right spot. So you can kind of have this tight integration between secrets and environments. Now, I will say that feature is only available if you either have a public repo or you pay for GitHub and you have a private repo. If you try and do the free private repos, you're not going to get access to environment secrets. You'll still get access to GitHub secrets, but you won't get access to environment secrets unless you have a public repo or you pay for GitHub. So just want to call that out for people in case they start to look into this.
That sounds really useful. And when you were saying about if you're writing something out to the output, how that gets masked out. So it sounds like whilst you can get it, you'd have to write code to explicitly get it, like, as you say, writing to a file or something. When you said about writing to a file, it made me think of like the concept of artifacts. So does that have kind of a stage? And again, sorry, I'm drawing parallels with Azure DevOps here because that's what I use. But can you have like a stage writing artifacts to that pipeline run, and then other stages can use it, or you can download it from the portal?
Yep, exactly. That's exactly conceptually how it works. So GitHub has GitHub artifacts where, hey, in your CI step, you want to upload those artifacts to GitHub artifacts. So there's a built-in GitHub action called upload artifacts that you just upload those artifacts. So those would be like your DLLs, JavaScript files, whatever you're actually deploying to wherever you're deploying to. It could be a Docker image, whatever it is. And then in later stages, when you're deploying to all of your different environments, you download that artifact or I should say artifacts because there's lots of files within there. You download that and then do whatever you want to it, copy it to Azure, AWS, or however that looks for your deployment process.
That sounds awesome. As I said at the start, it's kind of like, I really want to be able to use this a lot more. That kind of ties into something else I was going to ask about. GitHub feels as in, it's quite a social thing, isn't it? Where a social platform where there's lots of open source projects, people use it for hobby projects and that kind of thing. And I know now it's owned by Microsoft and everything, but I kind of wonder whether a lot of companies, like enterprise companies, get that social vibe of GitHub and that kind of puts people off. Is that shifting now? Now it's owned by Microsoft, or now it's being more, GitHub Actions is more mature? I don't know. Do you find that the landscape's shifting a bit with companies' mindsets?
Yeah, that's definitely a question that people have, is sometimes when they hear GitHub or even sometimes when they hear Git, they think, oh, this code's public to the world. And they might, a manager might have a misconception because they know what GitHub is, they know it's public, and they think Git is somehow that, even though Git is its own thing. So what I would say is right now, what I'm seeing is people aren't as worried about that as much. I think partially because of Microsoft, and then also the fact that GitHub has some of these enterprise things. They've got lots of different certifications, all of that kind of stuff. What I like about GitHub is it promotes an inner source mindset, which, we've got open source where you can see the source code, anybody can see it, it's public and all of that kind of thing. Inner source is kind of taking that mindset but applying it to companies. So it's not publicly available to anybody, but it's available to anybody in the company. And what's nice about an inner source mindset, let's say you integrate with another team, right? Or you depend on a component library or whatever the case is, some package out there. If you have an inner source mindset where, you can see what other teams are working on, you can actually say like, oh, this is how that code works. That's why I'm getting this error. You can send a pull request or open an issue or, link to somebody and send it to them over your chat messenger of choice saying, hey, here's the line of code that's being offended. And what I've also found with an inner source mindset is sometimes there's tension between teams, like where it's like, oh, what does that team even do? And now with an inner source mindset, you can just say like, hey, I'll just go see what they're doing because you can see their repos. So I would say GitHub kind of pushes people towards that inner source mindset because it started that way, right? It started with open source and then kind of became, they kind of lock things down kind of afterwards. And so there's still a lot of enterprise controls and things like that when it comes to that stuff. But I would say like other tools, like even Azure DevOps, like while you can do inner source, it definitely doesn't feel like that's its first class citizen way of working. Like it's kind of defaults to like everybody's kind of private and working on their own stuff. Now, again, you can totally set it up that way, but I feel like GitHub just kind of promotes things that way because that's kind of its ethos and how it got its start. But it definitely does freak some people out, but I find that I'm having less and less of those conversations.
Yeah, I think as a developer, that would kind of maybe companies hiring, I'm interviewing for a position, and I can see that they're using all like GitHub and GitHub Actions and all of this kind of thing. That would definitely be a selling point for me rather than I can understand. Like you can kind of understand classic companies that's in like old-fashioned companies being quite put off, like they're very enterprisey. But yeah, I think from a hiring point of view, it's going to like just like with other things like what language you're using, what technology stack using, it's all part of it. And I think it's kind of I don't know why, but it's air quotes. It just seems cooler.
Yeah, no, I had a very similar conversation with a manager who was trying to decide, what platform to go with. And that what you just said came up of like, hey, if you're doing GitHub, that is like a recruiting tool. Like it's a small one, obviously if you're not going to pay them well, that nobody's going to work for you. But, it can be like when you hear, oh, I'm doing GitHub, you feel like you're kind of on the latest and greatest, I would say, and like kind of the platform of choice.
Totally agree.
Nothing against the other platforms. Obviously, they're all great. It's just, GitHub obviously has a lot of mind share.
Yeah, definitely. So we've spoken quite a lot about, well, GitHub Actions, obviously, but also Git as well. And you've done 2 Don't Train courses on both of those topics, funnily enough.
Yep.
So yeah, as in I've had quite a few Don't Train authors on the show now, because I've done a couple as well. It's always good at the end to actually just chat about experiences creating these courses, because it's kind of, I just find it quite interesting because I've not done courses except for the ones for Don't Train. And I don't know, it was a bit jumping into the deep end because you're doing the videos with webcams on and all this kind of stuff. But I'm so glad I did it. It's been an amazing experience and journey. I'm just wondering what your experiences were doing it.
Yeah, so those are my first 2 courses I've actually ever created. And I've done a lot of conference speaking, done a lot of international speaking at conferences, and I've done workshops, both at conferences as well as for work and stuff like that, putting them on for companies and things like that. But I hadn't done a course, so I was just like, this feels like something I should try out. And so I talked to Nick Chapsis, who owns Don't Train, and chatted a little bit, and I was like, yeah, I want to give this a go. And he gave me a lot of good tips of how to up my audio video game because it was not up to par. But I would say like a big difference with video is, if I'm speaking at a conference and I like misspeak and I catch myself, I just kind of, fix it and move on and just say like, oh, I meant this or whatever the case is. Whereas video, I feel more of an obligation to like, properly fix it and say the right thing. And so I would say that was a big change of just that mindset shift. I know some people think like, oh, you should show your mess ups because, it makes you more, human or whatever, and more like real world. I shouldn't say human, more real world because we all mess up. But I felt like there was, depending on what it was, sometimes I would keep it in, but a lot of times I would go back and fix it just to make sure that, I'm saying things how I want to say them. And I'm saying it as clear as I can and things like that. So there's a lot more effort going into recording these things. And I did my own editing, all that kind of stuff. So I'd say for every minute of content, early on, it probably took me like 20 minutes to like plan it, edit it, re-record it potentially, those kinds of things. As I got faster at it, it was probably more like 10-ish or so. and got used to things. And then I knew like, hey, if I mess up, maybe just repeat the last sentence and then keep going. So then I could edit things. So I'm not like, if it's a 20-minute video, I'm not going 20 straight minutes. And if I mess up at minute 19, I'm like, oh, I got to throw the whole thing away. I mean, I could have done that, but I would not have any courses released if that were the case. So yeah, it's just a different format, but I like helping people at the end of the day because people have helped me along the way. Like I wasn't born knowing how to program or knowing GitHub Actions or any of that kind of stuff. Just like everybody listening wasn't. I learned from others, right? I read books, watched YouTube videos, conference talks, read things, whatever the case is. So I like having as many mediums as possible to help give back and do the same for others.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. When you were saying about repeating the sentence rather than the whole thing, it's funny how the more you do that, the more it becomes subconscious. And you find when I'm recording a video now, it's kind of, there's so much that I'm just repeating and repeating until I'm happy with it, then go to the next paragraph or sentence and repeat. I'm exaggerating it. I'm not like every paragraph repeating it, but as in, I just automatically, without thinking about it, go to the start of what I was saying and carry on. If I make a mess up or I'm not quite happy with it. And I do that subconsciously now. And then when I'm going through editing, it's just like chop, 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 delete, delete. I'm less worried about jump cuts now. I think with a podcast as well, because there's no jump cuts, there's no video. So I can really chop out ums and ahs and stuff. And you just can't tell, or if we repeat something or whatever. But yeah, with video, it's jump cuts. So kind of like much more aware of keeping still, just to minimize those jump cuts, or if I'm sharing my screen, making sure I don't move my mouse when I know I'm going to be, when I'm not talking, I don't move my mouse. So I know if I cut that, the mouse isn't going to suddenly jump away or something. So just little things like that, but it's quite funny.
Yeah, there's definitely some subtle things like that I had to learn the hard way, because when I went to the editing room and I'm like, oh, I accidentally, I paused here and then did some stuff, and maybe I just put a tab in my browser or something. Like I might have been showing a browser or something, and I put a tab in my browser, and now that magically appears. 9 out of 10 people probably wouldn't notice, but I noticed. So, it bothered me. And I'm usually in those cases, I, fixed it or something like that. Or at minimum, going forward, I'm way more conscious of that kind of stuff. Like, I feel like I should write a blog or record a video of like, here are 20 things to think about when you're, recording video. But no, it was a great experience. And yeah, definitely appreciative of it. And hopefully people find it useful.
Well, I will definitely include a link to those in the show notes. Is there anything else that we've not covered with GitHub Actions? I thought we've covered a lot of different things.
One thing to call out, GitHub Actions, we didn't really talk about this, is the concept of runners. So like you need something to actually run your code, right? So runners are kind of, you can think of those as VMs that kind of spin up when this trigger kicks off. And they actually need to do the CI, like compiling your app and deploying it and all that kind of stuff. So just FYI that GitHub provides you runners out of the box. So you can say, hey, I want a Linux runner or Windows runner, but then you can also make your own runner. So let's say you're deploying on-prem. Well, you need to have line of sight to deploy to your on-prem boxes, right? So just want to call out that you might, in case anybody's thinking that, oh, I'm not deploying to the cloud, I'm deploying to like a lockdown on-prem environment, I can't use GitHub. Nope, you can. You just use a custom GitHub Actions runner, and basically you just install an agent that kind of marries those two things up, and then all of the steps run on that virtual machine, that runner that you created. So I'd say that's the only thing that I just want to call out, because I hear people say like, oh, I can't use GitHub because I'm not, in the cloud. And it's like, well, yeah, you can. And a lot of, Azure DevOps, I think they call them agents or something like that, has a similar concept too.
So a runner is equal to an Azure DevOps agent. It's not equal to a build agent. Because a build agent is like the whole machine that it's running on. So like, as you say, if there's a VM, but you would run an Azure DevOps agent on that, which actually listens for events and does the work. So is a runner more like the actual agent part of it?
A runner is more the build agent part of it.
I see, yeah.
Yep. So it's actually the VM. So when you create separate builds, if you're using GitHub runners, you're actually getting separate VMs. Now, obviously, if you're managing your own runner yourself, because some people do this for like performance, maybe they want, a ton of cores or something, and the built-in runners are either too expensive to get the amount of cores that they want, or whatever the case is, or networking is the other reason. But yeah, a runner is more like a build agent, but then you install an agent that is like the thing listening and kind of connects GitHub Actions to your VM that you created.
Right. Okay. So if I decide I want the thing that builds my software to be my computer under my desk,
Yep.
that computer under my desk is the runner, but I would install an agent onto it, which is listening out for GitHub events and will know when to. So that would then do like a Git clone on my machine and then build it and then push that back to GitHub as an artifact.
Yeah, it depends on what your pipeline's doing, but yeah, if you pull down the repo and do some things, and then you can push back up to GitHub as an artifact, then kind of move on to the next step that then downloads that artifact from GitHub, or you could push it to your local on-prem artifact repository if you want. So it just kind of depends on what you want to do.
Awesome. Well, we are quickly running out of time, and I realised that we normally do dev tips at the end, and I completely forgot to think of one. So I don't know whether you got a chance to think of one, but we can either skip it or.
Dev tips. I did not think of one ahead of time. I feel like we offered a lot of dev tips throughout here with continuous deployment and stuff like that. So maybe those are our dev tips.
Yeah, I think so. We've got and there was that, what was it called? The ACT project. So that can be, let's call it a joint dev tip then.
Yeah, sounds good. Yes, ACT is our dev tip.
Awesome. I'll include that in the show notes then. Well, with that, just a massive thank you for joining me on the show. It's kind of like, as I say before, this is really kind of motivating me to do more with GitHub Actions. I have to persuade all my clients to completely move over and move away from. No, I won't say that. But yeah, it's been really fun chatting with you. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dan.
You're most welcome. And a big thank you to everyone for listening. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, which is DRACAN. And like you, I can't call it X. It's always Twitter in my mind. But the best place to get in touch with me is on Discord. And like all the links we've spoken about today, including the Discord link, can be found on the website, which is unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.